Hello, I'm Trenton Clark with the Virginia Asphalt Association, and I want to welcome you to the Asphalt Plant Level 2. And now we're in Chapter 5, Duties of the Plant Level 2 Technician. As we go through this chapter, we're going to cover the aspects of the job that you as a credentialed Level 2 technician need to be able to perform. So as we go through this chapter, there's a few learning objectives we want to make sure we stress upon you. We want to make sure you know what the primary roles are of both VDOT and the contractor as it relates to the testing of asphalt mixes. We also want to identify sampling and testing functions that the Plant Level 2 technician actually performs. So we're going to go through those. We're going to identify the various mixture tests that you must be able to perform for acceptance and payment. Keep in mind, as a Level 2 technician for the contractor, your test results are used for payment purposes. So that's why we're going to spend some time on that. We want to make sure you understand VDOT's quality assurance program. What is your role as a contractor, and what's the role of the department representative? We want to identify what are those major responsibilities that VDOT has to perform, and then we're going to touch on that referee system, because undoubtedly we'll go through the season and there will be times when we each get a different set of results. Sometimes those different results may end up in a change in pay. So if we have to invoke the referee system, there is a process in place to determine final payment. So let's get into it. What is the Plant Level 2 technician? Well, if you think about it, we have the contractor side. Where do we spell it out that we need it? Well, you got to look in specs themselves. In section 200 of the spec book, it lays out the materials related stuff. And if you actually look in 200.06, it clearly defines what that asphalt plant level 2 technician must be able to do. You're doing any of the tests necessary to put the plant in action. You're not changing mix designs, you're not adjusting them, but you're putting that plant into operation. You have to be able to sample from the truck. That's why you need to be Plant Level 1 certified to know you can pull the sample, that you can reduce it by the quartering method, and then perform the various tests that you need to ensure product acceptance. And we'll walk through each one of these. So first, let's talk about putting the plant into operation. In 211.05 of the specs, which covers asphalt mixtures, it gives you a long description. But what I want to draw your attention to is that only the asphalt mix design technician, remember, only the asphalt mix design technician, he's the one or she's the one responsible that that mixture complies with the requirements of the specs. As a Plant Level 2, you're doing the testing, you're providing the test results, you're giving the test results to your mix design technician. They're the ones responsible for checking them over. And even more importantly, if there's adjustments that have to be made, that responsibility lies with the mix design technician. So you have the Plant Level 1 that can do just the sampling and quartering. You have the mix design technician who goes about and ensures that the mix meets spec. As the Plant Level 2, you're collecting that information and giving it to that mix design technician. And if anything needs to be changed, that's their responsibility. So what test as an asphalt Plant Level 2 technician do you need to be able to run? You need to be able to run the AC content. How much liquid is in the mix? Once you've burned off the liquid, you need to be able to run a gradation to see, do the gradations in that finished mix, how does it compare back to the mix design? You need to be able to do rice testing or determine the maximum specific gravity of that mix. You need to be able to use this information to calculate the volumetrics. How much moisture is in the mix? It's not a complicated test, but you need to be able to do the math to say the mix has 2%, 3%, 0.5% moisture in it. And you also have to do tensile strength ratio. While we don't do it throughout the whole production of the project or for that mix for a season, we do need to make sure that we can do it during mix design and within that first lot to make sure that we have the strength really in terms of anti-strip, that when we compress that material and do the tensile strength, that it's at least 80% or higher. And then mix permeability, and that again is done during mix design, and you may be asked to do it as a plant level 2 technician for the mix designer, but on these surface mixes, we want to make sure that water cannot flow through it quickly or flow through it at all. So let's look at mix testing for acceptance and payment. For acceptance and payment purposes, one, we need to know the AC content of the production mix. So at the design time, we say this has 5.8% AC content. When we go to produce the mix, do we have 5.8%? Now don't be startled if it's not always exactly 5.8. We're not making asphalt mixes in a factory where everything's completely controlled. We have lots of variables. But during production, we do need to be within a range, depending on the number of tests, which will be covered in the mix design class, that maybe we're at 5.9, maybe we're 5.7, but are we averaging right around 5.8? We don't have any excessively high or low numbers. We use the ignition oven, so we take a sample, we put it in the oven, we burn it off, and we know how much material was lost. We have a correction factor. All these things will be covered in Chapter 6, how the process actually works, but that's one of the tests you run. You also do a gradation, so once we've burned it, we're going to do an AASHTO T30, a wash sieve analysis to see, again, do the gradations that were designed and the gradations in the mix actually match. And we're going to walk you through some steps in Chapter 6 as well. There's some other properties that you need to know about. We talked about RICE, or the maximum specific gravity of the material. What that means is if you take an asphalt material and there's absolutely no air in it, none whatsoever, it's 100% asphalt aggregate combination, essentially what does it weigh? Now, when we determine the bulk specific gravity, we realize there's air in it because you can't get all the air out in the field during compaction. So what we're looking at is what's the bulk specific gravity, how much air is in it, what's the maximum specific gravity, and just doing some math, we can tell what the actual air voids are. Now keep in mind, the bulk specific gravity always has to be less than the maximum specific gravity because air doesn't have any weight to it. So if you go through the process and your bulk gravity is heavier than your maximum or your RICE, something's wrong. You're also determining volumetrics such as voids and your FA ratio. So in the specs as you read them, you got VTM, which is voids in total mix, VFA, VMA, FA ratio. We're following a couple more AASHTO specs between R35, T166, T269. These are all different tests that as a level 2 mix designer, you must be able to perform proficiently. Moisture, not very complicated, but we need to ensure that the aggregate's dry and the wrap is dry. So we're looking by spec less than 1% in our total mix moisture. We're looking at tensile strength ratio, basically to make sure that the aggregate doesn't strip, because there is aggregate that even though it can make a good material, when water is introduced, the water can cause the asphalt to strip away from the stone. We lose our strength, we end up with cracking, we end up with rutting and other durability issues. So we check it. Keep in mind, all VDOT mixes have to have an anti-strip agent, whether it's with hydrated lime or a chemical anti-strip. The materials have to be on VDOT's approved list. But what you're doing TSR is just to ensure that mix design that the designer put together does meet that minimum requirement, and there's a whole test process. And we're also checking permeability. Again, we want to make sure in those surface mixes, if water is introduced on the surface, that it's not flowing through. So we're really checking the number of air voids and the size of the voids to make sure that the water doesn't pass through. So, why is a certification required? That's a good question. Pretty simple and straightforward. Code of Federal Regulations. So federal law basically says that if an agency uses contractor test results for payment purposes, the agency has to have a quality assurance program. So here in Virginia, the contractors do the testing of their mixes, AC content gradation. Because they do AC content and gradation, and those results are used for payment, VDOT has to have a quality assurance program. Goes on to say the people have to be qualified in what they're doing. So as you look further into everything, we have to have training procedures, we have to have certification procedures, we have to have proficiency procedures. All of these roll into why you have to be certified, why we have these classes in place. Keep in mind, you have to know the procedures. So how often you're testing, when you're testing. And with that AC content gradation, we're testing basically randomly every 500 tons of mix produced. So from 0 to 500 tons, we're taking a random sample. 500 to 1,000, we're taking another random sample. Every 500 tons for AC content gradation, we're doing random sampling. You'll hear the term stratified random sampling. So in our acceptance process, we treat a lot as 8,000 tons of mix. Well, if you take 8,000, divide that by 500, we get 8 sublots. So that's the stratification, as we test each of the 8 sublots. And then within those 8 sublots, we randomly select a tonnage to do the AC content and gradation. So it's stratified random, and that makes sure that on an 8,000 ton lot, if we're doing completely random, we could have 8 tests between 7,000 and 8,000 tons, which is statistically fine. However, we didn't do any testing in that first 7,000 tons. And as we all know, we're not making these mixes in a factory. Things do change, so that's why we're doing them every 500 tons to stay on top of it. And we're using those results for payment purposes. We're also testing the mix at the plant. So if you look in the specs and in the test procedures, that first truck that we're getting ready to ship to the project, we're checking the temperature. If it's within spec, the 5th truck. If it's within spec, then every hour we're testing one of those trucks to check the plant temperature. Yes, we have readouts in the plant. We can go to the drag chute and check it there, but for acceptance purposes, we're testing it at the back of the truck, and you need to know how hot's too hot. So your A and your D mixes were at 350 degrees. Your E mixes really depend on what the manufacturer tells you, because they may have modifiers in there in the polymers that have different temperatures which you don't want to heat them up beyond. So you need to know what those requirements are. We talk about mixture volumetrics. We're going to get into more details in Chapter 6, but we're doing VTM, VFA, VMA, FA ratio, and we're doing a RICE or GMM. These are all pass-fail criteria, but the difference between AC content gradations and volumetrics is, one, we're doing it every 1,000 tons, and once we exceed 300 tons, but we may not produce 1,000, anytime between 300 tons and whatever that maximum is for that day that's less than 1,000, we need to pull a volumetric. But when we get the results, we're comparing them back to the table in spec to see, are we between 2 and 5% for most of our dense graded mixes for VTM. And based on the aggregate size, where are we at on our VMA? So we're checking those, and if we're outside of the criteria, then we need to determine real quickly, why might that be? Is it a bad sample? Make sure you resample. Are we consistently running tight? Are we consistently running open? Which may require slowing down, maybe even going to shut down, making adjustments to the plant before we ramp back up. But again, we want to make sure we're shipping in-spec material, so it's just pass-fail criteria. It's not a payment criteria. We have an independent assurance program. That's what VDOT is tasked with doing. Independent assurance is just making sure that the processes, the people, the procedures, the equipment's all being done properly. We're not saying does it pass or fail, But are my results and your results comparable? We're not saying if it passed or failed. We're just checking one to the other. We got a detailed process in the manual of instructions. We're performing it on AC content, gradations, and temperature. And we're basically doing it on every other lot of material. So it's not done at the same frequency that the contractor's doing that. And it can be more than every other lot. You know, it may be early on you're doing a lot more IA, and as everything steadies out and becomes more uniform, then you're back to the minimum requirement. But again, what you see in the manual of instructions are the minimum requirements to do that testing. We have the verification, sampling, and testing, or VST. What is that? That's basically now we're looking at the volumetric results, if we need to do an absent. But what we're looking at again is the material that's being produced within spec in regards to the volumetric side. So we're pulling a sample, we're taking it back to the lab, and again, we're checking it to see if my design air voids or production air voids needs to be between 2 and 5%. Is that what we're actually getting? And then we do a subsequent test check where we've got that split sample because the contractor got material at the same time. How well do the two really correspond to one another? Did I get 1.5% and VDOT get 5.5%? Clearly there's not agreement in the results. But if I got 2.1 and they got 2.5, then we probably do have agreement in results. So that's part of the verification, sampling, and testing. All right, so what's the responsibility of a VDOT personnel in this overall process for a plant level 2 technician? Well, if you're VDOT plant level 2 credentialed, there's a lot of things that you're doing. You're observing. So you're coming out to the plant, watching that plant 1 or that plant 2, or even the mixed design technician pull a sample from the truck. You may be watching them quarter that sample down. You could be standing there and watching them actually perform the testing. So they pull the sample in, they've quartered it down. You may be there to watch them how they do their AC content, how they do the gradation process, how they're making the pills, how they're running the rice. VDOT also takes those materials back, and your level 2 technicians are doing the lab verification testing. So they're doing the volumetrics. They could be doing the IA, checking on the AC content gradation. So they're doing the same tests that the contractor is doing in his lab or her lab. And you always have other duties assigned that's not in your work profile because things are constantly changing. So as a level 2 technician, as we're changing over to different design processes and acceptance processes, what we'll be doing in the future probably will be a little different than what we're doing now. If you're a consultant, it really depends on who your client is. If you're a consultant and you're working for VDOT, you may be performing the same duties as that VDOT level 2 technician. Observing, collecting samples, watching tests being run. There's very possible you might be able to take that sample back to your credentialed lab. If you're the contractor and that's who you're hired for, you're doing what the contractor's person's doing. You're sampling, you're quartering, you're testing, whatever's needed for the quality control and acceptance portion of the process. As I mentioned at the beginning, there will be times when the contractor's results and the department's results will not match. Sometimes they're a minor match, but sometimes they can actually result in stop work, they can result in pay reductions. And at that case, there's a whole process in the specs called the referee system that walks you through how you go about determining final payment. So we're using that for questionable results. Usually we're going to pull samples out of the field, and there's different sizes that we pull out depending on the mix itself. And then we take it to a third-party lab. Maybe it's an AASHTO resource accredited lab, maybe another VDOT lab, maybe someone else that they're running those samples, really see what's the AC content gradation of that material that goes into final payment purposes. So we have a whole process laid out to ensure that the correct payment is assigned. Remember, we're paying for asphalt by the ton. And any adjustments to that per ton price, whether it's a disincentive or a bonus, goes back to AC content gradation. So it is extremely important from the very beginning of the sampling and the quartering that it's done properly, and each one of the tests are done properly, because that determines final payment. Also remember, every time a load goes out, whether it's a virtual ticket like an e-ticket or a paper ticket, you got to have a weigh ticket. So we have moved most of the industry over to electronic ticketing, whether that's through an app sending test result or the weigh ticket results electronically through a PDF or other form to the inspector. But that weigh ticket accompanies each and every load that goes out, because we want to make sure the right product is going to the right project, it has the right tonnage. At the end of the day or the end of the shift, we also have those TO102s that actually summarize all the daily tonnage sent from that project or from that plant to that project, because that's how payment will be determined. And with that, there's an overview of what the duties are of the Asphalt Plant Level 2 technician. If you happen to have any questions, please feel free to ask your moderator or contact us. There's plenty of knowledge checks at the end of this chapter. So look through there, answer those questions. Remember, you can refer back to the end of your book and get those answers to those questions. Thanks a lot and good luck.